Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second chapter of the theory of economic development from Schumpeter. And with us leading the discussion today, we have Dr. João Romero from the Federal Universities of Minas Gerais. He took his PhD at the Land Economy Department from the University of Cambridge, UK. And since then, he has been working on development economics, economics of science and technology, economic growth under external constraint, international economics, post-Keynesian economics, and financial system. He is considered a Caldorian by many of his colleagues, and he's going to bring a little bit of a Keynesian thinking into our Schumpeterian discussion. So without further ado, I'm leaving the floor to Dr. Romero.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction. As you said, let me put my notes here on the screen. I'm bringing, my main research is on development economics, especially focused on Caldorian theory, but I've always try to bring some of Schumpeterian theory into this, into my research, given that innovation is, for me, key to understanding development. So I'm actually glad to have been invited to lead this discussion. I will try just to bring some points and hope that will motivate other people to comment on some of this, the questions that I bring. Can you see my notes there on the screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I just put here some very brief description of the chapter that we're discussing, which is chapter two of Schumpeter's theory of economic development, which is a very interesting chapter, and is basically, in my view, where Schumpeter develops the core of his theory of economic development as he describes in this book. As you are well aware, his views in capitalism, socialism, and democracy change a little bit. So, but our focus today is on the theory of economic development. The most interesting thing for me is this change that he proposes, and it's, for me, amazing that he could come up with such an interesting discussion of innovation and development, writing in 1912, which is the original first version of the book. So he basically calls attention to this dynamic perspective of development in chapter 2, contrasting with the static circular flow that he presents in chapter 1, and which was described in the last webinar. But the interesting thing is how he characterized the innovation process, basically as a process of qualitative and big changes that occur through time, in comparison to this more or less static mechanism that works within the circular flow. As I pointed out here, Schumpeter divides this, the innovation process in 5 main categories, which are interesting, but it's very broad. And one of the things that I would like to discuss is how broad this division and this characterization that he proposes is, and how basically, doesn't everything fit into these categories of innovation, especially in terms of opening new markets. And this is one of the most interesting things when we are comparing and trying to analyze Schumpeter in comparison to Keynes, for instance. But another point that is very interesting in the second chapter is that the characterization of the entrepreneur that Schumpeter brings, with a discussion of the difficulties involved in innovating and what are the characteristics that the innovator or the entrepreneur has to have in order to lead the process of development. And well, something that will be discussed a little bit more in the next chapter, but which already starts here, is the role of the banker and the role of credit in the process of economic development. So I think discussing these two actors there is very interesting. It's one of the high points for me in this second chapter. So basically, going straight to the discussion points, what I tried to do is mainly highlight some of the things that Schumpeter talks about in this chapter, and try to think of how close it is to some modern theories of development. Basically, for instance, if you think of the new Schumpeterian approach of national innovation systems, or if we compare to some Keynesian aspects of economic growth, which are more short-term. This is something that we are discussing earlier here with Biziana. Also, like, could be pointed out that actually Calder is the Keynesian author that is studying the long term, which would be closer to a comparison to Schumpeter. But I think using Keynes is a good reference point, especially because both Schumpeterian and post-Keynesian literatures deal a lot with the problem of uncertainty and how individuals try to cope with uncertainty and make decisions in this context, and also like how to define this type of uncertainty. There are a lot of words that both in the neo-Schumpeterian and in the post-Keynesian literature that discuss the different types of uncertainty that there are, and try to analyze the differences, the different processes of dealing with uncertainty and deciding about how to act. So the first, well, we can go back and follow a little bit more on the chapter, but I thought it would be more interesting to focus on the questions. And of course, as other people extrapolate or propose other questions on the chapter, I think this will be the most interesting part, which is when we can discuss and bring our ideas about what were the insights that Schumpeter brought in his original paper, original book, actually. So the first question that I propose is, of course, like trying to combine this Keynesian and Schumpeterian approaches. Discuss what is Schumpeter's view about the role of demand in the innovation process. He talks a little bit about that in chapter 2, but quickly dismiss the possibility of demand having a considerable impact on innovation. So doesn't he like underestimate this role a little bit? And I would like to hear what you think about this provocation, I would say.
Ben, would you like to?
Sure. Since I can talk now, so I should use it a little bit. Of course, if someone else would like from the participants would like to add something or say something to this, is very welcome. And you can also reserve your turn in the chat, or just write your comments in the chat. Okay. But so going to the question raised by João. Yes, I think it is a very important question, and I would disagree with the idea that it does not consider the possibility of demand having an impact. I think he says that there might be very big changes in the tastes and preferences of the consumers, and this can lead to rather large and sizable changes in the economic structure. But he says this is something that can be already covered with existing theories and does not require the development of a specific theoretical apparatus. So it's more like Schumpeterian innovation cannot work through a demand channel. and therefore, since he's interested in discussing what I described as a Schumpeterian innovation, that is his own conceptualization of innovation, demand in that sense plays less of a role. Not that demand play no role at all, of course, in economic development in general. But this is my perspective on this.
Yeah, well, just a technical question before you continue. Should I deactivate my microphone while others are speaking? How do you?
No, it doesn't.
No,
you don't need to.
No need to.
It does not create any problem for us.
Okay.
There is a you want to say something, João? Please.
Yeah, no. So I kind of agree with you, but not entirely. He specifically says that, well, demand is important and that there could be like a feedback channel, like consumers trying to lead the process of innovation. But he clearly states, I'm trying to find the exact page here.
Yes, I think you are looking at page 66.
Yeah.
Yeah, then I think my numbers here are different because when I put on the notes, it's not exactly the same when I saw your notes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but in the end, like there is like a debate. I don't know if you came across this discussion, possibly yes, like about demand pull and technology push,
Yes.
Yeah.
which has been rising again, I would say, more recently. And I think the possibility of the demand having a bigger role in innovation, I think I think there's more to that than just simply like changes in preferences. One of the channels that have been highlighted recently is the return on innovation, which is clearly changed when demand is growing or not. So, for instance, if a firm has an invention and is planning to bring this invention out or to the market, it will clearly want to do that in a moment where demand is high and the economy is growing, because then they will have a much higher profit in the market. So it's not that the technology side and the science side is not important. Of course, it's fundamental, but how much demand can lead that and influence, and for instance, how much of resources are liberated to be invested in R&D, for instance, which is this question of demand pull. It's I think it's a key question that in general, although like the Schumpeterian literature does not disconsider entirely the possibility, I think is underplayed, I think, in my opinion. But
could I just
yeah, I want
could I just throw in a question? Sorry.
Yeah, go
on. I was just wondering, because when you read about his importance of capital in general and banking and finance, so is there not an implicit assumption that there is enough demand for that capital to be invested? Because when we look at, for instance, the situation right now, the central banks all over the world do pretty much anything in order to get rid of their, or not to get rid of the capital, but to get banks to borrow. But because there is no demand, nobody's borrowing. So I was just wondering if there might be some implicit assumption when he's talking about banking and finance that demand is a prerequisite for innovations to work. I mean, that would go into the direction what you just said, but yeah, that was just one thought.
Yeah,
please, João, please.
No, yeah, I think you might be right. Actually, it's another thing that when we read Schumpeter's definition of development and innovation, which is basically like it's structural change and new uses of the resources. So he clearly says that he's not interested in employing resources that are unemployed. So it's a different question. So to a sense, he is already dealing with a situation that is more or less with a set of conditions already in place. So demand is probably one of them. So it's very supply oriented, but yeah, I agree. Maybe demand is a condition that if it's not there, like how well the rest of the theory stays in place. Yeah, that's...
But if I may add, because my reading of this chapter is very different from the comments that I'm listening here. What kind of demand are you talking about? Because if we're talking about consumers' demand, which is what he mentions as an importance, is totally backed up by the time that this book was written in 1913 or 1919. Depends on which version you're reading. So basically, the demand pool that we use right now, it's very different from what he actually mentions as demand in his book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hence, it's very comprehensible that he just considers the supply side, because we're talking about a completely different economy that right now we're talking about different consumers and different preferences. So to me, it's very consistent with the way he sees both development and innovation, that he doesn't consider demand. I don't know. This is just a comment that I thought.
No, I agree. Like the type of demand he's describing is this consumer-producer interactions, right? And yeah, I'm talking here about demand in a more in a broader concept.
Yeah. Sorry, can I enter in the discussion? Yeah. Well, I'm Danilo. I'm with Mary here with me, and I think there is a difference between the discussion of consumers' demand and effective demand, because it seems like the discussion is going towards the idea that you have a problem of effective demand, and Schumpeter doesn't address it. But as far as I can see, he doesn't need to address it in his role, because he doesn't have the treasury role of money that Keynes constructed itself that generates this problem of effective demand in the end. So Schumpeter is in a world in which there is still the sales law happening, and the whole role of demand, it mainly works as a feedback loops on shaping the technological trajectory of the innovations. So I think that there are two discussions being done right here, and actually. Yeah, sorry?
Yeah, no, I was agreeing with you exactly.
Yeah, so I think Schumpeter would, it seems like for me that this discussion, at least if we are reading exactly Schumpeter right now, are a little bit anachronic, because Keynes' critique came in 1936. So I don't know, I just don't see how Schumpeter would answer to that. I don't know if you do have an idea as well, João.
No, yeah. I agree. It's just an impression that I think in the end, as someone else said, I think I missed the name here. I think it's Patrick. That in the end, it seems that demand is a prerequisite for the whole process that Schumpeter is discussing. So this was my view. This is why I started with this discussion.
This is Mary here, speaking from Daniel's. But I actually disagree with that, because he even talks about that. Well, when we talk about new markets and also of itself the innovations, part of the role of the entrepreneur, in fact, is about creating new demand and teaching the consumer of their wants and needs, and that they need this new product. Yes. So, and also creating new combinations and essentially new products, essentially does mean that the role of the entrepreneur, in some sense, is about creating new demand and convincing others about creating new demand. And the whole process of innovation itself is this creation of new demand.
Yeah, I agree. But if, like, theoretically, we can see that in two forms, right? Basically, the idea here is what is constraining innovation and development. What you're saying is that as innovation occurs and new combinations are carried out, then new demand will be created. Yeah, of course, like you can create new needs in the consumers, but where's the money coming from to finance that?
It's not.
Yeah. So my point is like, if well, the company is innovating and is putting out new products to market, but demand is low. Of course, he can still capture part of this market and will break some of the firms that were operating in like loss. So basically, creative destruction that we will describe in the book. But how far can this go, and how many firms can afford to do that, and how is this innovation going to be created? So maybe I'm mixing a little bit of the discussion of the books, but I don't know. I think it's still like a little bit underplay there.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between the financial accrediting process that he discussed, which plays an important role, and of this creation of new products and demands, right? So the entrepreneur comes in as a really important factor here, and his role is multifaceted. One of which is to convince the financier to provide credit. And that's an important thing, so that therefore he can use existing productive structures that already are in the economy to create new combinations and new products. And then on the second hand, the second part of the feature is then these new products create new demand, new consumer demand to be, rather than effective demand, that as in a Keynesian sense. So this new combination, it's his job in the second part to convince consumers that they need this good and they should buy this product. So I think those are two separate features in this chapter that I think are really is very interesting. How he lays that out separate from the circular flow of the economy.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting that he explicitly highlights. No, maybe it's in the next chapter, that the type of credit he's interested at is the one that you described, like productive credit to switch the means of production from one sector to the other and basically channel it to innovation, and not consumer credit, which is again another tip that for him the demand will be created by the innovator, which in practice, I don't know if it's what happened. I think in times of crisis and when demand is low, innovation tends to decrease as well. So this demand pull, technology push debate is basically in terms, like so far is basically being in terms of the response of R&D to demand and things like that, not focusing that much on research intensity, which is the important thing. But again, I don't know. I think it's more to that. But I think maybe we're leaving a little bit of the topic of the book. So maybe we could pass to the next question, which
Could
is.
I just say one thing from the book on this? Just a comment. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was having a problem entering the discussion before. There is this comment from the chapter from Schumpeter where he actually says that when there are unemployed workmen, unsold raw material, unused productive capacity, and so forth, which he says, by the way, that this is always the case. This is the situation of low demand, let's say. He calls it a contributory circumstance, a favorable condition, and even an incentive to the emergence of new combinations. So it's the opposite here. So we are not saying that when demand is high, that's good for innovation. It's actually saying that when demand is low, it is good for innovation. So in Schumpeterian theory, in this chapter in particular, demand is treated as relevant, but with a completely different direction than how it is discussed in the current debate, as you were referring to. So because for him in this case, since there is low demand, it's easier for the entrepreneur to get hold of the productive factors that he or she needs in order to operate. So completely different perspective here compared to what is discussed in the current literature, which I think is an interesting comparison, and perhaps we should discuss what are the assumptions that lead to this different situation.
Would you mind, Ben, just to give the page number of that particular passage?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm using the version of the book that we uploaded. It's and on that book, it's on page 67, right in the middle of it.
Okay, perfect.
So you can hopefully find it.
But yeah, that would be actually a perfect argument for that question, right? If demand then is not, or if demand is underestimated. I mean, that just nailed down the relevance of the question that was just posted here. And I think
yes.
Personally, yeah, when there is no demand in the economy, when people don't have money, you can produce whatever you want. They won't buy it unless it's something which is already established in the market, but you find some new way of producing it, which is 10,000 times cheaper or something, then yeah, people might still buy it. So from that perspective, demand in general might not be that relevant, but overall, I think, yeah, it always comes down to what people can actually afford to buy. And if that is not given, then yeah, you can do whatever you want and people won't buy the products. I think this is where I would agree with, how do you pronounce your name, João or João?
Well, it's pretty tricky. It's the Portuguese version of John, so tricky to pronounce. But you can call me João. It's fine.
João. All right. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
But so just a last comment. I think Ben was perfect there, because this is exactly what I wanted to call attention to. Because of course, like in theory, both arguments could be valid. For instance, let's say we're in a crisis. A firm would have a higher incentive to innovate because the market is shrinking. So I want to innovate so that I can capture the market of other firms. So this like makes perfect sense. And also, if demand is growing and the market is big, the firm will try to innovate to try to capture a higher share of this market that is growing. And so this is the point. Like both explanations are theoretically valid in my point, which in the end is a question of like, in practice, what's happening? So empirically, does this work or not? And which is a more recent approach to this question that he was already trying to infer. And the interesting thing about Schumpeter, as I said, like he does not dismiss the importance of demand, although discussing in a somewhat different way. Of course, like 1912, the world was entirely different, the economy and everything. But I think I would agree with you too that in a crisis, although firms still have an incentive to innovate, I think it will probably be harder to do that. On the one hand, because they are suffering losses, so they don't have that much resources to invest in R&D and create innovations, and also because they will profit less from these innovations if they release in that moment of crisis. So
yeah, but if I may add something to that, that is specifically what Schumpeter says that won't happen. Because by quoting directly, he says, on the contrary, new combinations are, as a rule, embodied, as it were, in new firms which generally do not rise out of the old ones. So he means that in times of crisis, this new company, I mean, this entrepreneurs form out new and take care of new means of production. So to me, it's like this, as the reading I make of this, of the way he says that new means of production arise independent of demand from the consumers, but from a demand of changing the status quo. That's why he, like the last part of the chapter, is a call towards the entrepreneur who can actually seize the moment of crisis and change the change the way things are being produced, and compete with the incumbent. I mean, this is how my brain works from business school, but this is how I read it. It's kind of a little bit contradictory with the way you read it to a certain extent, no?
No, as I said, like, I think this is his point. I agree with you. I just don't know if this is in practice how the things work. So if in the time of crisis, there is more innovation than when the economy is booming. So this is the question.
If I can add something to that, I think there are two forces going both in favor and against innovation during time of crisis, right? Because yes, it is probably less expensive to obtain the factors of the production factors that the entrepreneur requires, but at the same time, the entrepreneur requires credit, right? That's a big point of half the chapter. And we know that in time of crisis, credit is harder to come by. So from an empirical perspective, which seems what you are discussing, what is actually the case, right? What is in our empirical experience actually the case? The question is an empirical one to be investigated with empirical means. From a theoretical perspective, it seems, however, that the question is not decided clearly in Schumpeterian theory. So on some perspective, it's more favorable, on some others, it's not.
Indeed, exactly. But I think maybe we should move on to the next question, so we can address the other ones that I posed. As I mentioned, one of the things that I think it's not very clear, like in terms of the chapter, is that how he differentiates what's innovation and what is not in terms of his concept. Well, it's very clear that he says that development and innovation, development actually is carrying out of new combinations. But so what is a gradual small change within this circular flow, and how big a qualitative change it has to occur so that we can characterize as development? So this is more or less what the discussion I wanted to bring with the second question. Let me put it on the screen here, which is this question of, would incremental innovations fall into Schumpeter's concept of development, or only radical innovations would be characterized as development for him? So I do not have a clear answer for that. So I would like to hear what you guys have to say.
Danilo? Okay, Mary? Or okay, go on.
No, I would try to answer it, but Baz, if you want to go first.
No, to me it's again business school brain in here. Going back to the paragraph that Ben mentioned before, to me, Schumpeter, in this chapter, in this specific chapter, in this specific paragraph, he considers the introduction of new methods of production, the opening of a new market as development/innovation, because to a certain extent, the way he characterized development is through innovation, through an introduction of a new mean of production. Hence, I believe my reading of this text is that he definitely considers only radical innovation as the one who brings development, and not incremental innovation. Incremental innovation to him is just good leadership to a certain extent. So my reading is that only radical innovation will bring new change of mean of production. So it's at least my brain reads it as pretty straightforward to a certain extent. I don't know what you guys think. Danilo?
Yeah, everyone agrees. Like
No.
Sorry.
We don't all agree.
No, yeah, I'll answer I would answer trying to come back to the concept of equilibrium, because he starts chapter 1 by developing the concept that is very well known in the neoclassical theory, explaining all the equilibrium that comes in the economic theory, and how actually he comes in the second chapter to say that this equilibrium actually it changes all the time, and it changes basically because there are always new combination of goods, and this new combination of goods, which is what leads to development, is basically related to these 5 points that he puts in the chapter. So I would say that innovation, even if it's incremental, it doesn't need to be a radical. It can generate development. So in my like in the way I read it, maybe Ben could add to that as well, because he made a much more thorough reading during his PhD. But it seems to me that it appears that any kind of innovation, even if it's radical or incremental, that leads to development, because it generates a disturbance in the equilibrium, and it takes to new combinations.
Mary, do you have a different position?
No, quite similar. I mean, there are 2 things I might add. Well, one is that in these 5, there are some things, okay, that are clear, of like having new combinations of a new good, and that itself can be radical. But the other ones he describes, like conquest of a new source of supply of raw materials, or even of process innovations, introduction of new methods of production, are quite incremental processes. They're not a complete, like when I think of radical innovation, I think of usually completely new goods. And here he describes, and I think for the first time in, at least in my reading of economic history, making a distinction between different types of innovation, where in the kind of the circular flow, and even in today in neoclassical economics, there is some sort of, basically every time it's some shock to the system that we call A of technology that, you know, rattles the entire system, exogenous or endogenous, it's still a black box. But for the first time here, he uncovers that there are different types of innovation, both incremental and radical. So I think that was actually what's really nice to this chapter, is he adds these specific processes. But in regards to development, I'm going to throw in here, he doesn't talk about it much in this chapter, but he does hint at it, which is this difference between quantitative and qualitative development, right? So how development in himself is, and he talks in here a little bit, but development is not only about growth of wealth, right, or population. It is this qualitative change which comes about through these innovations, and these innovations can be both of any of these type 5 that he's listed, which is both incremental or radical.
Yes, I would agree with that. In fact, I would even say that he
Ben, we lost you.
Yep.
put contract development and growth. So economy, growth of population and wealth, is not the process of development.
Sorry, we lost you. Can you repeat again? Because we couldn't hear you. Ben? Okay.
Oh yeah, it seems that he had some problems there.
Yeah.
Well, it seems that there is his back.
Sorry, I need to do this every 10 minutes for some reason. What I wanted to say is that there is a contraposition between economic growth and development, in the sense that development is not at all economic growth. It's a completely different phenomenon. So it's not that, it's also something else. It's actually not economic growth. And to try to agree with most of what you have been saying, I would say that although he is pretty explicit saying that he is talking about, almost always is talking about what we would consider radical innovation, because what he's actually talking about is everything that is outside the logic of the circular flow. So incremental innovation, to the extent that it can be integrated in the logic of the circular flow, then is not development in its turn. And although some, as long as the incremental innovation is outside the logic of the circular flow, then it is development. So it's mostly the contraposition between the circular flow and the autonomous change that allows you to discriminate, in my view, between Schumpeterian innovation, or as we want to call it, economic development, and what is not economic development.
Yeah, I think.
Wouldn't you say?
Yep. No, go ahead.
Sorry, the only question that I would have, I would be kind of, or I have problems to see these, and I don't know if you do actually, but that was the way that I understood it, to see development and economic growth as two different entities or concepts, because even though, yes, I think you're right that they are not the same and shouldn't be used synonymously, I think development can then lead to economic growth by especially increasing productivity. If you think about, some new mode of production that's going to need much less hours for the same output, that then can lead to economic growth because people can then start to work on something different. So.
Oh yes, absolutely. I would agree entirely with you here.
Okay.
Yes, it's just that he's trying to separate the concepts. Not saying that development will not in any way be linked with growth, or the fact that economic development will not bring eventually growth, but he's saying they're not the same thing. They are two separate things. And then the relationship between the two will actually be discussed at length in the coming chapters. So I agree with you there.
Okay, cheers. I just wanted to clarify that because it wasn't entirely clear to me personally.
Yeah, well, so just some quick points here. So I think in the end, the disagreements here show that this question is not very simple. There's not a clear answer, I think. Basically, I agree with Ben that in the end, incremental innovations, if they're changing, changing something and escaping the circular flow, they will be characterized as development for Schumpeter. And I think we will all agree that they are crucial for economic development. But there is one particular passage of the chapter that brought me this question, which is, I think my version here is different from yours, but it's section 2 of the chapter in the second paragraph that starts to produce means to combine materials and forces within our reach. Then he says, insofar as the new combinations may in time grow out of the old by continuous adjustment in small steps, there is certainly change, possibly growth, but neither a new phenomenon nor development in our sense. So this, I think, would be more or less connected to incremental innovations. And then he continues, insofar as this is not the case, and the new combinations appear discontinuously, then the phenomenon characterizing development emerges. So for me, it seems there that he is more or less clearly saying that in his view, the process of development is mainly connected to radical innovations, which is this continuous changes in the circular flow and of a bigger magnitude. So let's see if you have a different impression of that. But I think incremental innovations for him are out so far.
Yes. Shall we move to the next question, or do we have any comments on this from?
I would agree with
yeah, me too.
with what is said here. So absolutely.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so let's move on to the next point, which is turning to our attention to the role of credit. So basically, the question here is that how can we connect the approaches of Keynes and Schumpeter in terms of credit? It's important for both approaches, but for different reasons. And basically discuss a little bit how the importance of credit emerges for Keynes and Schumpeter, which is something that I think Ben already mentioned. But any comments, or I can talk a little bit?
Well, if you could tell us a little bit more about what do you mean on the approach of credit in Keynes? So which particular passages from Keynes are you referring to, or if you're referring to Keynesian or post-Keynesian approach in general?
Yeah, I was referring to the post-Keynesian approach more broadly, but mainly because in Keynes, credit, as we were discussing in the beginning, of course, it is important to create production, and again, there's a difference between short-term approach of Keynes and the long-term approach of Schumpeter. But here, I think like Keynes, for Keynes, credit is important to create the production and bring the economy to full employment, which is not at all how Schumpeter sees it, which is giving the innovators and the entrepreneurs the power to switch the means of production towards new combinations and innovations. So for me, the interesting thing there is, although they're both focusing and highlighting the importance of credit, it's in totally different ways. And I don't know if you all agree with that, but.
Well, personally, I agree that there are substantial differences, although in the money view, for example, which is considered something that might be seen as somewhat Keynesian, at least coming from the Minskian side. It is also based on the credit theory of money, which comes from Schumpeter. So I think there are differences, but maybe these differences are more in what credit does in the theory rather than the conceptualization of credit itself. In a sense that, of course, since in let's say in the original Keynesian theory of the general theory, there is no innovation, right? So clearly, credit cannot perform any role there, since the process or that particular feature of the economic system is not present at all. Right, but I think the two conceptions are not incompatible. I think they are compatible.
Yeah, definitely, and I agree. Like I was trying to find where, but Schumpeter also highlights that it is credit that creates income, and in the end generates savings, and not the other way around, which is very interesting because he predates Keynes in a couple decades there. And although Keynes is the one that's known for this proposition, it's already present here in chapter 2 of Schumpeter's book.
I think that in this chapter, the role of credit for Schumpeter is is specifically looking at it at the firm level and looking at it at the entrepreneur. So at this point, he's not talking about the general macroeconomic effects of credit in the system as a whole, only in the sense that the entrepreneur, that credit encourages or allows innovation or new combinations of products to happen vis-a-vis the firm or entrepreneur, which I think is the firm level discussion is not really in post-Keynesian or Keynesian discussions very often. So at this point, which I know that in the future, Schumpeter and furthermore Minsky will talk about it in a more general sense, in a macroeconomic sense, but at this point there is a distinction between firm level and macroeconomic and the effects of credit at those levels, in the sense that Keynes is more macro, and at this point, Schumpeter is at the firm level.
I would agree for this chapter, absolutely. But here Schumpeter is setting the ball, so to speak, because right now it's simply stating if you want to have a development starting from a situation dominated by the circular flow, then development will be linked with credit, right? You will need credit to operate this, to effectuate these new combinations. And then in the next chapter, the macroeconomic consequences of this will be illustrated. So I completely agree that up to this chapter, the discussion is in microeconomic terms.
Okay, so I think not many disagreements there. So moving on to the next question, then, like, well, which is related to the previous one. Well, Schumpeter's approach to innovation and development is compatible with Keynesian growth theory, and here I would I put Keynesian growth theory, but it's actually the Keynesian branch that analyzes long-term growth is the Caldorian approach. So which is mainly one of the things that I've tried to do, and I would like to hear your options or your thoughts there. Is it compatible and or not, and what do you think about that? And of course, focusing on the writings here of the chapter.
Well, it would be interesting if an expert on Caldorian growth theory would tell us his initial thoughts on the matter. You know, just coming from that side, then coming from perhaps a more Schumpeterian friendly side, we can say what we think.
Yeah. So
and also, if you could just throw into some of the comments that we had in our discussion of question 1, because the feeling that I have is that question 1 and question 4 are somewhat related in a sense.
Yes, yeah, indeed, they are. So it's basically the question here is like, well, from a Caldorian, like Keynesian Caldorian perspective, growth is demand-led. So Calder's explanation, it's a little bit different from Keynes, because although, like, so just to put questions 1 and 4 in context, question 1 is more related to Schmockler's book of 66, which you probably came across. So it's innovation and demand. The Caldorian approach is similar, but the channel is a little bit different. It's not that much innovation in terms of new products, or but more in terms of new methods of production and new machines that will be put to use. So the Caldorian idea is that as demand grows, then firms can use more productive machines and have a higher scale of production, and therefore become more productive. But also that as demand grows, there is a higher incentive for innovation. And the type of innovation that Calder is mainly concerned about is innovation in production methods and machines again. So it's not that much in the product and product innovation, but and actually this point he brings from Alin Young that discussed the increasing returns to scale in a paper of 1928. And the classic example of increasing returns to scale that Young mentions in the book is that, well, let's say you want to put a nail into a wall. You don't need a hammer for that. You can grab a stone and put the nail into the wall. It will not be very efficient. Maybe the stone will break. You need to find another one, but eventually you will succeed in putting the nail into the wall. if you need to put 100 nails into the wall, then a stone will not be very efficient and will probably be more interesting if you put some effort into creating a hammer to do the job. And of course, if you have now like 100,000 nails, then you have even a bigger incentive to create something more efficient, let's say like a nail shooting machine or something like that. So the point is, and which actually brings us even back to Adam Smith, but this is in a static term. So what Adam Smith says is that the size of the market determines the level of division of labor and of productivity. So it's a very static, intra-firm approach to increasing returns. Caldor is a little bit more dynamic, saying like as demand grows, then firms have a higher incentive and put more effort into creating these innovations. So this is more or less the perspective, which is correlated with the first question, but not entirely the same, because I think Caldor disregards a little bit the role of product innovation. So like, which is for me something that still has to be explored. But given this explanation in mind, again, we turn a little bit to this that could be antagonistic approach of science and demand interacting in the generation of innovations, but now more again in the long term. So would it possible? So are the two approaches compatible or not? That's the question.
Well, on this, I would just like to say that in the Schumpeterian system, innovative activities are not linked to incentives arising from the system, right? Because that would be adaptive behavior. And it's not what Schumpeter describes. So Schumpeterian innovation is everything that is not, in this example, Caldorian innovation. Mm-hmm. So since we are talking about two different phenomena, I think it's the research can be compatible indeed, because we are not saying different things, we are discussing different phenomena, and therefore bringing together different phenomena could work perfectly well, in my view.
Well, I don't entirely agree. Like I agree that maybe it could be compatible, but I think they're in the end discussing the same phenomenon, which is productivity growth and innovation.
Well,
and
productivity growth does not figure in Schumpeterian writings, right? So, no. I mean, R&D and investment in science and so forth is not really what you find in Schumpeter. In neo-Schumpeterian writings, absolutely, they are of course there and they are essential. But in Schumpeter, we don't see this. So in this chapter dedicated to what?
Ben?
Economic development is. We don't see the productivity.
Ben?
I'm really sorry for this.
No problem.
I hope something got across what I was saying.
No, say it again.
Oh.
Okay, just saying that productivity growth is not really what you find here, right? This is the chapter defining what economic development is, according to Schumpeter. Is the chapter dedicated to define the nature of economic development, and we don't see productivity growth. There is no discussion of productivity growth. So we can discuss, of course, economic development as productivity growth, but then this is not discussing Schumpeterian theory, which is fine, of course. But we should keep in mind that these are separate phenomena.
Yeah, well, he doesn't mention that explicitly, but he clearly states that, well, within the circular flow and what he means is that there is this production within the concept of a production function. So I think in the end, he has in the back of his mind that productivity is the key there. But I agree, it's not exactly the same. But in the end, innovation, which is the point, I think. And yeah, well, although, yeah, I agree, it's not directly related to productivity.
I mean, there's also the reason that the GDP, when Schumpeter was writing this book, was not really defined yet, not in this term. So those terms that are so familiar to us
not exist back then. Yeah.
So there is also that problem. So perhaps if he was writing in the 50s, maybe he would have used these terms. Perhaps we might speculate, but we have to agree that they are not present here, I hope.
Yeah.
Sorry, just may I interrupt? I have some considerations on that, more like trying to answer but putting more questions, because I see a clear difference between productivity growth and innovative process that qualitatively change the content of products and processes. So these, I mean, you can have qualitative change, and these may lead to productivity growth, and this may lead to growth in itself, but it's not what Schumpeter is talking about in the way I could read it. He's more like trying to see how the circular flow, it's not a static thing that develops itself through time, and growth is not the goal of the issue. Like, because I see that I can observe a little bit why these questions come from, and it makes sense from our perspective, especially after so many decades of Keynesian theory. But I think that for Schumpeter, it didn't necessarily make sense, because growth is not an end on itself. But I maybe just some considerations that I try to defend a little bit Schumpeter in this.
Well, I think this actually brings an interesting question. So so let me explain first. Like, for me, like innovation is clearly associated to productivity growth. I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but nowadays it probably would be undisputed. Basically, because again, now we're moving to another book, but as the entrepreneur creates innovation, he will have temporary monopoly rents, so that the markup of the product will increase, and value added will increase, and then productivity will increase as well. So I think implicit in the creation of innovation is increasing productivity. But this turns, like, if we focus then exactly in Schumpeter's point here, this brings out the question then, like, what's the point of development here, if not increasing productivity? New combinations, but for what? This is more or less the question.
I guess let me throw this, add another question to all this. How important is productivity to Schumpeter, and how important is that for development to him? Because what I'm trying to get at is productivity more of a quantitative approach to him, where it might not actually, like, how important is that for him as a whole for the impact of innovation? Is productivity an important aspect to development for him?
So I think there are two types of productivity. So let me just highlight that. So there is physical productivity, which is like, if I'm producing more of the same good in 1 hour, let's say, then I have higher physical productivity. But there is also different aspect of productivity, which I think it's not in general considered, which is this one that I mentioned. Let's say I'm producing the same amount of goods in this 1 hour, but now the goods that I'm producing are of better quality. Because of that, I will be selling at a higher price, and I will have a higher profit. And because of that, value added in terms of hours worked will increase. So productivity will increase as well. So we have two types of productivity growth there. One is basically productivity growth within the circular flow, which is a movement, let's say, along the production function. And the other one is a shift of the production function, which is what Schumpeter meant by new combinations, in my interpretation. So in the end, what the type of productivity growth I'm interested is the one of qualitative changes, which is related to Schumpeter's view. This is my point of maybe misunderstood there. But in the end, turning back to the question, I think new combinations here in chapter 2 are mainly to increase productivity, increase production. Otherwise, what's the point in economic development, right? I don't know, maybe you have a better understanding of this chapter.
Well, João, I think the most important point actually has been already mentioned by you, is that those who innovate will have short-term monopoly rents. And if you think about it, first of all, it must be something either completely new or a completely new mode of production, which leads to a situation where if you didn't have these higher output per the same working hour technically, then I don't really see any way in which you could reap monopoly rents. So I think that basically answers the question, that productivity, even though it wasn't defined as it's defined now, is really central in what he also had in mind. And I don't really see a problem with having some measure or some definition for a measure that is applicable then to theories which didn't really think explicitly or didn't explicitly mention that concept in their writing. So I think that yeah, there is quite a good fit in here.
I would just like to say, perhaps on this issue, what is the point of development then, if not productivity growth? That again, as we said before, here we are still discussing matters from a microeconomic perspective, right? So it's clearly the entrepreneur is not motivated by productivity growth. Can we at least agree on that? That from a microeconomic perspective, productivity growth is not the objective, since that is, especially on the qualitative term, that is probably a macroeconomic, something that has more value at the macroeconomic dimension. And in his discussion of the motives of the entrepreneur, of course, productivity growth would not figure, right? And
on that, actually, I think what I found
speaking
pretty
what we would call economic, which is also interesting. And
Ben, I think you're falling again.
Ben, we lost you. Mary, you were saying?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought that he was done, but it turned out he was the internet attacked. Ben?
I'm really sorry. It's, I'm not doing this on purpose. I can at least promise you that. I just saying, perhaps only the last thing that we can see this explicitly in the third part, when the motives of the entrepreneur are described, right, which are not economic in nature. So I would say that yes, if we are taking a macroeconomic perspective, then of course we can discuss productivity growth. Although of course it's not here in this chapter. Although in the next chapter, these issues will start to be more visible, although in different terms at least.
Building on that, Ben. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I want to build off your comment.
Yes.
Which is what I found striking and important in the analysis of his in the last part of that you're bringing up, which is that what is the entrepreneur's motives? And in no way, we usually think of it as profit maximizing, cost minimizers. That's what firms do. End of story, right? But that has nothing to do in Schumpeter's perspective, and I find that really interesting in him laying out in the last paragraph kind of the 3 or 4 different features of the entrepreneur and why he chooses to do this, and has nothing to do with economic, as you said, it means, but about creating new combinations, the creativity of that, conquering and in some sense power, and developing his kingdom. So maybe we want to talk a little bit more about the microeconomic motives of the entrepreneur, which actually has nothing to do with economics.
Yes, which I think ties in with the idea that economic development is never about economic incentives, right? So it's never because there is a demand, demand-generated incentive to increase production, or there is the possibility to cut costs, right? Because this would be, according to Schumpeter's definitions, an adaptive action, and instead is interested in creative action, creative behavior that by definition lie outside the incentives that are generated by the system. So essentially the entrepreneur is disregarding these incentives and is acting through, therefore needs to act on a different basis. And he proposes 3 different possible options for this. Of course, we can add more, and as he says, this is not a necessary part of the theory, as long as we say, and is acting motivated by something that is not pure economic incentive, then we are in Schumpeterian theory. Then what we can discuss what is actually motivating him, right?
That's actually a very interesting point, because I think it highlights one of the main characteristics here, which is his vision of the entrepreneur as one of, and this is why he brings this analysis of the importance of leadership and the characteristics of the leader. And indeed, there's nothing there in terms of, well, not nothing, but very little about the importance of profit or consumption. So there are other motives in terms of why the entrepreneur is innovating. But one problem, and turning again to the economic perspective on that, I think even if we're in a microeconomic perspective, if the innovative firm does not succeed, then we'll have losses, and in the end, it will break and it will bankrupt. So even though the motivation could be different, if there's not productivity growth and if there's not profit involved, then they would be driven out of the market, which is a little bit related to the evolutionary approach that was later highlighted in Schumpeter. But I'm just mentioning this just again to state that in spite of the motives of the entrepreneur, there is still the profit there that has to occur. Well, basically because that's what characterizes, that's what differentiates an invention from an innovation. So it will have to take place, and in the end, again, it will result in productivity growth, either if it's the objective of the entrepreneur or not. And then there I turn back a little bit to Keynes, because for Keynes is investment is basically looking for profit. So here, not necessarily. Still, profit is the objective of the firm. So this is the point. But I think we're running out of time, so let's move on. And this. Well, I think maybe if we're running right out of time, let's skip question 5 and turn to question 6, because we're going to continue here just for
we have time
10 more minutes or so, right?
So,
no?
So we can go on. We have time until 9, so the discussion is, don't worry about time. Usually
okay.
are about an hour and a half, so we can go with that.
Okay. So still on the Keynes-Schumpeter debate, question 5 now is related to the decision-making process implied there in Schumpeter and Keynes. Here, again, he does not discuss that explicitly in terms of. I think he does not develop enough, although bringing some interesting points, and basically related to the problems and the characteristics of the leader, and which in this case is the entrepreneur. And the interesting thing for me is that he highlights that not many people have this characteristics. So if we compare both approaches, and in terms of Keynes, Keynes' problem is in terms of investment, long-term investment. So there are some similarities. I think the main difference is that the amount of uncertainty involved in innovation is much higher than investment, even in the long term. So I don't know how we could relate the two approaches, but I think they're very close in terms of the interpretation of how the process works. So I don't know if there's any interest in this question there.
Okay, Adriano has a question. You can read it on the chat, João. I have a question on this issue of the motives of the entrepreneur, probably to Ben. Schumpeter finishes the chapter saying that the discussion of which are the best stimuli for the entrepreneur, given that most of their motives aren't really about economic, is a discussion that is beyond this work. But he says that giving the stimuli is something possible, and people don't used to give enough attention to that. So
yes. So did Schumpeter talk about anything about stimuli in other works? The Cure article that has been translated into English some decades ago is a regional publication. I would need to look up exactly the title to that, but it's quite interesting because it goes a little bit beyond pure economic theory. Right, so this is why he doesn't want to do this here, because this book is about economic theory, and he wants to keep it that way. But there is at least a nice article dedicated to that, and I dropped again. God damn it!
I think we lost it. I'm.
And I'm back. I just want to say that I can send the article to you if you're interested. Just send me your mail with a message, and I can send you that article and anything else that will come to mind. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Does someone want to talk? Because I have a question, but it's a question I thought would be important to ask, because I don't have I have the idea, but not the concrete answer about the role of competition to Schumpeter. Because if one of the motives, if the motives of the entrepreneurs to innovate is not based on, it's based on non-economic aspects, how is going and then how competition would be a mechanism of trying to push, because I have some problems into rationalizing the argument as well. I mean, because competition is understood by economists as a way to push the capitalists to invest, but in Schumpeterian theory, he mentions about competition, but it's not necessarily there in the chapter.
Well,
João, would you like to?
yeah, well, I think, well, Danilo, I agree with you. I think my interpretation of the chapter and of his description of the entrepreneur is, well, maybe it has to be understood in the context of the time. So I think back then, innovation was not the same as it is today. If you think, it was still like the beginning of like more complex process of production. So I think innovation there was more dependent on the will of the entrepreneur to go there and do something new and search for new applications of means of production. And so I think in this context, my interpretation is that it's sort of an idealized vision of the entrepreneur. So nowadays, I think the interesting thing is that this type of incentives that he's describing are nowadays clearly overlooked. And of course, especially if you're bringing science and other things to the process of innovation, of course, there is more than just looking for profit. But as I say, I agree, and the role of competition is more or less the same. I think it's close to the argument about profit that I just made. Like he mentions that it is important that there is this process going on, but I think it's more than he's highlighting there. I don't know what's Ben's impression.
I may just add something to that from a more general reading of Schumpeter is that I don't really think that competition for him is really a key to innovation. He's actually quite, I don't know if it's in some of the later chapters or if it's in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, that he's actually talking quite favorably about monopolies because he's seeing all these benefits of having economies of scale, of having a lot of smart brains within one company where you can create synergies. And he's saying that the only way or the only monopoly which is quite bad is when, first of all, new modes of productions are not being developed, when potential entrants into a marketplace are being basically kept out. So under these two conditions, monopolies are disastrous, but generally, I don't really think that he sees them as a problem. And he also has some quote saying that there is no justification for any antitrust authority or something like that because it is just based on some static economic thinking that competition will just, I don't know, lead to innovation and everybody will be most efficient and so on and so forth. So and he also lays out the argument that, for instance, when you had competition in quotation marks, that was pretty much when no economic development happened. So everything that was preceding capitalism in the centuries before, I don't know, roughly 18th century. So everything that was preceding before was technically close to competition, because you had a lot of very small firms. They were producing commodities, but there was no innovation in that system. So I think from that perspective, he says that you need big firms and less competition in that sense, more cooperation, in order to have proper development. That's my personal understanding. I don't know what you think about it.
Just one point there. I agree that he turns to this view of the innovation related to lower competition, but let's remember it's monopolistic competition that he's talking about. So it's like still, I think competition is important even within the context of lower different market structure, let's say. But I think if he doesn't mention that much of the evolutionary process here, like especially in this chapter. He just mentioned Darwin's method in the very first paragraph, but from that we can understand, to my view, that competition is important. Is one of the parts of this Darwinist process that he's discussing, which is later highlighted in the creative destruction. So like only through competition this will take place, and also will create an incentive for imitation and like start moving the evolutionary process there. So basically, like I think competition still plays an important role in Schumpeter, but here in the chapter I agree, like it's not that present.
Okay, if I may add something, not only competition in this chapter doesn't appear at all, not even as a notion whatsoever, but I found that the last part of the chapter was entirely dedicated to the notion of what an entrepreneur is, what an enterprise is. Yet, I have two issues that I would like to raise in the discussion. First of all, could you, João, or you, Ben, actually make a clear distinction between the definition that Schumpeter uses for entrepreneur and the definition of capitalist? And the second, I found that the last part of the chapter, again, the part dedicated to the entrepreneur, has close to nothing to do with economics in my reading, and more to do with this sociological interpretation of the maverick alpha male that comes forward and changes means of production and goes against institutions that see him as an outcast, and then he changes the game. So to me, it was more a reading about a certain type of new man that was building up in the 20th century, rather than a real economic literature. This might be like me influenced by feminist literature right now, but that is the reading that I did. So first, could you make a distinction between what he means by entrepreneur and what he means by capitalist? And then about this all new man, alpha male entrepreneur, and what did that mean both for the period, and how is that evolved, that notion, through Schumpeter's work?
Ben, you want to go first?
I don't think Ben is here at all.
Oh, maybe he fought. Well, so I agree with you. As I said, like it's here. I think we have to read the book within the context of the time it was written. So it's more focused on the endeavors of practical men that are trying to, discover new markets and open new firms and apply materials to new uses and things like that. So I think it's a sort of an idealized vision of the entrepreneur that he later changes a little bit. So knowing that his perspective has changed also tells us something about his vision of the role of the entrepreneur in the economy as well. So I think we have to take that into account.
I would just like to add two quick things. First, on the distinction between capitalist and entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur is the agent of change, and the capitalist instead is the possessor of general purchasing power. Okay, so at least from a theoretical perspective, these two roles can be completely separate, and this is what he does. So he assumes later on that the entrepreneur does not possess any purchasing power at all. And the capitalist is in complete control of that. At the same time that every qualitative economic change is initiated by the entrepreneur himself. This is for the first thing. I hope this might help, but we can discuss it further, of course. And the second, on the second thing, on your reading, I think is warranted in the sense that you were not the only one. Absolutely, many people read it this way, which is why, and this annoyed Schumpeter because he didn't want to give out this message. But clearly, there is something wrong there because many people read this passage and interpret it exactly like that. So here, Schumpeter is guilty of writing wrong. But in note 3, number 3 to this chapter, right? He says, one of the most annoying misunderstandings that arose out of the first edition of this book was that this theory of development neglects all historical factors of change except one, namely the individuality of entrepreneurs. And the point is that here the entrepreneur is merely the bearer of the mechanism of change, and he doesn't want to glorify him in any way. And he tries to fix it by saying we are calling him a leader, but it doesn't entail any particular charisma, and he would not be even recognized as a normal leader, part of other leaders. So he tries to take away from these representation, which is not what he wanted to do. And I think in the business cycles, he managed to give a perception that is more closer to what he actually meant to say. But in this, I want to say that your interpretation, I think, is really close to what he writes, and it is unfortunate because he didn't want to express that, but he does.
For the sake of being literal, there's this passage which I wrote down like alpha male, which it says, then there is the will to conquer, the impulse to fight,
yes,
to prove oneself
yes,
superior to others, which is so worrisome if we think about the time that this book was written on and what this meant for the period. Yeah.
Absolutely. And my favorite passage is another one in which it says a certain policy can be almost as effective as racial hygiene.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
there are bad things if you look for them, and clearly this passage gives exactly this impression, which is why I say that I agree with your impression. I think this is the impression one gets after reading the chapter, although it's not what he wanted, and this is why in later writings he stay away from these sorts of descriptions.
Well, yeah, he had to for what was happening around him. But so I'd like to add something that it might be a little bit, I don't know, like contradictory, or it can open up a discussion. But I tried to talk with Ben about this before. So basically, the way I read this chapter, not my personal view of this chapter, but I thought that the way of reading this chapter, you could also use or misinterpret to a certain extent Schumpeter towards making a case of what we're hearing right now in current policy of the startup nation and the startup world. He makes this notion of institutions not helping, of the entrepreneur, of rising the cult of the entrepreneur as somebody who actually moves away from capitalism. Maybe the second generation of entrepreneurs are typical capitalists that move through social class and so on, but the first generation of entrepreneurs is always somebody who's trying to change the status quo, who's a maverick, who sees crisis as an opportunity. And that is something that has been sold to us by the neoliberal state for the past, I think, even since I consider it since the beginning of Facebook. But venture capitalism and startups have been up since the 80s, since the starting of the Silicon Valley. So how can you debunk that? How can you say, no, Schumpeter didn't make an argument for the startup nation. Schumpeter, by his use of credit, he didn't mean that you should go to venture capital. And the cult of entrepreneur that he prices, it's not at all, to a certain extent, complicit with the cult of entrepreneur that we are living right now. How can you debunk that? Both of you, like João and Ben.
Well, very interesting question. But let me just go back to the previous one. So just one quick comment. Just to say that the role of competition shows up a little bit in chapter 2. There is here in my pages here are different, so it'll be tricky to tell. But in the last page before the notes start, so when the paragraph starts like with the entrepreneurial kind of leadership, and then he says like, well, he leads the means of production into new channels, but this he does not by convincing people on the desirability of carrying out this plan or by creating confidence in his leading in the manner of political leader. The only man he has to convince or to impress is the banker who is to finance him. So this highlights more or less the division that you mentioned between like the capitalist, which is in this case the banker, and the entrepreneur, that's someone that does not has access to the means of production. But the interesting part is the next one, and then he says he also leads in the sense that he draws other producers in his branch after him, but as they are his competitors who first reduce and then annihilate his profit. This is, as it were, leadership against own will. So I think it's one of the few places where he mentions competition. But there you see that there is implicit in his thinking that this fight for profit. So like there is innovation, but they're all fighting to have profit and imitating one another and trying to steal each other's profit. And this is, of course, one motivation that, although is not emphasized, is of course there. And I think it would be naive to think that he does not consider that important, although he is calling. I think his point here is to call attention to other motives that are usually disregarded or not that much emphasized. But I'm sorry, going back to your question, which now I lost it. If Ben wants to start, please.
Yes, just very quickly, in consideration of time, we're running a little bit late. I just would like to say that, well, first of all, Schumpeter never says that economic development has nothing inherently good in it. So, and he's very explicit in this. Economic development is simply change, and the change might be negative. Therefore, already the entire system that generates something that might be good or bad, depending on conditions and institutions.
And we lost him again.
Setting is already different from the neoliberal.
No,
yes,
we lost you for the last part. Can you repeat again?
Okay. Yes. So economic development is not inherently good in Schumpeter. It can be good or bad depending on the condition, economic conditions, social, economic considerations. Therefore, a system that produces development is not necessarily good. It depends on how this development is produced and what kind of development is being produced, according to Schumpeter first. And second, to pointing out that according to him, the trustified capitalism system, for example, as opposed to the competitive capitalism system, is preferable in terms of shared prosperity and in general in improving the general welfare of the population. So this model is, according to Schumpeter, is already inferior to others, So it's not the best model. And secondly, you can never forget the socio-economic institutions around it. You can never make a pure economic argument for the neoliberal startup nation.
Well, on that point, I think we also just lost Ben, unfortunately. We're on, about 10 minutes late, so I would like to close that out on that point. And thank you, Dr. João Romero, for being our discussant for Chapter 2. I think it was really interesting, and we had very good debate and discussion. Our next seminar will be on, or webinar, I should say, will be on chapters 3 and 4 on December 5th at 7 p.m. CET. That is in 2 weeks, also on a Tuesday. And Dr. Tanya Trebich from Maastricht University will be discussing chapters 3 and 4. If you can also look up on our YouTube channel for the recordings of this session, as well as all of the sessions regarding reading Schumpeter. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, guys.
Please stay in touch. Stay in touch on our event online, because that's where we are going to publish this this recording. Thank you again, João. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Mary, for organizing all this. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.